Queen Cixia had defeated Ubitha, a tyrant notoriously known for her vicious and ruthless rule. She was only 19 years old when she established her kingdom. After that, she went on to conquer many more kingdoms one after another. It was impossible for the 99 kingdoms and republics to stand against Cixia. It was all thanks to the blood chalice. Besides the chalice, the cup of governance, Cixia also had many powerful allies standing firmly by her side. It had taken her 10 long years of hard work to build Valencia into what it was today. She was now 29 years old, a wise and beautiful queen. Believers throughout the kingdom eagerly welcomed their queen and wished her everlasting happiness and prosperity. Queen Cixia was strong. She was beautiful, wise, and affluent. Nothing seemed capable of standing in the queen's way. However, there was one matter that continued to be brought up in court. A minister pointed out that if she rejected all 13 men who wished to become her husband, she would eventually be left with very few options. Cixia immediately dismissed the idea, saying there was no point because she was not going to do it anyway. The minister insisted that she had to, arguing that if she wanted to establish a secure foundation for the kingdom, she must think about the future. Before he could continue, Cixia warned the Chancellor of Dandelion not to say another word or she would have him thrown out. The old Chancellor ignored the warning, prompting Cixia to order that he be dragged out immediately. Enon quickly intervened and asked her to show some respect to the old man. He pointed out that if the Chancellor of Dandelion were kicked out now, he would end up looking like a traitor. Cixia instantly called Enon a traitor instead. Enon casually replied that he was only trying to improve his image. Cixia then reminded the Chancellor that she was extremely busy and was only listening to him because of his position. She sarcastically suggested that since he was already old, he should return to the countryside, spend time with his grandchildren, and enjoy a peaceful farming life. The Chancellor answered that he would see his grandchildren when he was done dealing with her, adding that to his grandson, this old man was a precious treasure. Cixia then questioned why she had to marry just to feel safe. The Chancellor replied that the foundation of the kingdom had to be secured. Realizing what he meant, Cixia asked if he simply wanted an heir. When he nodded, she argued that she was the one who had created the kingdom, so why should she have to bear a child just for the throne to continue? The Chancellor calmly explained that he did not want all of her hard work to fall into ruin. After all, she had no brothers, no children, and no distant relatives. Cixia then turned to Enon and asked why he did not simply become king if she were to die. Enon called it a flattering remark but claimed that he was far too busy. Hearing that, Cixia immediately exclaimed that this was exactly what she had been trying to say. She began ranting about her exhausting schedule. Every morning she woke up early, attended a meeting, ate breakfast, and then attended another meeting right afterward. She complained that she was so busy she could not even enjoy a cigarette during lunch. She spent her days reviewing endless appeals, meeting ambassadors from all over the country, and dealing with mountains of documents. There were so many papers and so many lines to read that she became dizzy just looking at them. Cixia continued venting her frustrations, asking who would clean up after her messes and who would clean up after everyone else's. She even sarcastically asked if anyone wanted to take her place instead. Even after dinner, more meetings were waiting for her. There were countless things she wanted to eat but could not enjoy because of her responsibilities. On top of that, she constantly had to learn new things and acquire more knowledge. Whenever she finally lay down to rest, she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined herself sitting through yet another meeting. She worked day in and day out without rest and could no longer tolerate it. Her frustration eventually shifted toward her clothing. She angrily questioned why she had to wear such uncomfortable clothes before ripping apart her dress. Watching the scene unfold, Enon could only think that Countess Electa would probably faint the moment she saw this. Cixia then declared that the first thing she would fix was that ridiculous dress. Turning to the Duke of Lionheart, she ordered him to take responsibility and find her something comfortable to wear. The Duke could only stare in confusion and repeat the word comfortable in disbelief. Cixia immediately reminded him that it was an order, causing both men to bow their heads. A beautiful and wise queen. Yet for the past 10 years, this had been her everyday life. Meanwhile, in the artisan city of Belm, the owner of the torn dress had already begun a journey toward the capital of Valencia. That story had started 8 months earlier. 8 months later, at Valencia Palace, Cixia was stirring her soup while thinking that all of those bastards would make a fuss if she did not eat with them. As she sat at the dining table with the others, one of the men urged her to eat her meat. Cixia refused, but the man responded that if Her Majesty put down her spoon right now, then he, who had not eaten a proper meal in days, would also put down his spoon. He even declared that he would ignore court etiquette if necessary. Cixia challenged him to go ahead if he was willing to risk something like that and slowly lowered her spoon. Looking at his plate, she pointed out that he still had around 5 plates left to finish. Deep down, She was filled with frustration. She wanted to break everything around her and throw herself onto her bed. Even while eating, her corset felt unbearably tight. The clothes she had worn to sleep the previous night had been so comfortable in comparison. At that moment, Enon informed her that he had finally found and brought back the person she had requested, although he did not understand why he was the one handling such matters. The designer had taken Enon 6 whole months to find, which was exactly why Cixia had called him in today. The man who had received the invitation. The designer responsible for loosening up the restrictive clothes. Cixia decided to clear the rest of her schedule for the day, stating that she could not focus on dinner anyway. When asked what she planned to do afterward, she admitted that while she was curious about the rumors surrounding the designer, she was even more curious about why the person who had received her royal seal had not come to see her immediately. After confirming that the designer's name was Yuri, she ordered Enon to bring the designer to her at once. Meanwhile, Yuri found herself wondering how she had ended up in such a situation. She had been summoned to the palace and ordered to make clothes under the direct command of the queen. Her thoughts drifted back 7 years earlier to the city-state of Ronda. On that day, she had heard people asking whether the queen was there, only to learn that the queen had already departed for somewhere else. Someone then pointed toward Enon Lionheart and referred to him as a traitor. People whispered that he had cut off his father's head and offered it to the queen. Others argued about his past, mentioning that he had been abandoned as a child, while some insisted that killing one's father could never be justified. Curious about the commotion, Yuri tried to see what everyone was talking about. Unable to get a clear view, she climbed onto a statue. Excited, she finally spotted him and was amazed because it was her first time seeing a white horse up close. Her mother immediately panicked and shouted at her to come down because it was dangerous. Unfortunately, as Yuri tried to climb down, she lost her footing and fell. Someone nearby shouted that a child had fallen from the statue. Yuri then introduced herself. In her previous life, she had dreamed of becoming a costume designer, but instead she ended up trapped in a dusty little pattern room. She had joined a pattern company full of ambition, only for life to become harder and harder. As a result, she started drinking more frequently. By the time she turned 30, she drank so much that she was hit by a car and died. Coincidentally, the name she had in her previous life was also Kim Yuri. Even she thought it was an incredibly ridiculous way to die. If she had to be reincarnated, she at least wished she could have been prettier. As a child, she spent much of her time crying, which often led people to give her unpleasant medicinal herbs to drink. Yuri hated the medicine and hated the situation even more. No matter how depressed she felt, she knew she could not continue living like that forever. Looking around Ronda, she noticed that commoners wore loose-fitting clothes that were rough and unattractive. The men wore pants that only fit when tightly tied around the waist. As for the nobles, they dressed in multiple layers that looked as if they had simply been tied together with strings. To Yuri, all of it looked uncomfortable and ridiculous. Eventually, she decided that if she hated the clothes so much, she would simply make better ones herself. Her previous life had been filled with endless hard work, so compared to that, this new life felt almost like a blessing. The first thing she needed was a tailor because her sewing skills were practically non-existent. While she had confidence in creating patterns and designs, she could barely sew. Unfortunately, her mother refused to help turn it into a family business. What Yuri truly needed was a capable tailor and someone who could recognize her talent. However, she quickly realized that most skilled people already had jobs supporting their families and would never abandon their work to partner with a child. At 13 years old, nobody would hire her seriously. Even if someone did, she would probably be stuck removing stitches and handling embroidery instead of designing. Yuri was already tired of doing meaningless chores. That was when she came to a conclusion. Somewhere in the artisan city of Belm, there had to be someone with a good eye for talent. Humans were advanced beings after all. Filled with determination, Yuri set her sights on the artisan city of Belm and decided to leave for a new beginning. Yuri had finally arrived. Standing before her was Belm's most famous boutique, Ataraxia. It was huge, wide, and incredibly tall. She had heard that in most stories, anyone who traveled to Belm would eventually visit Ataraxia, and now she could see that none of those stories had been lying. There was even a doorman standing outside. Yuri couldn't help but wonder if the clothes he was wearing were some of the boutique's products. She stared for so long that the man eventually asked if something was wrong. Realizing she had been staring, Yuri quickly explained that she wanted to meet the boss of the place. The doorman looked confused and asked if she meant the owner. After a brief moment, Yuri realized he was referring to the Lord of Ataraxia and eagerly confirmed it. However, the doorman immediately told her that the Lord was far too busy to meet someone like her. Yuri insisted that she had brought an amazing item specifically for Ataraxia. Unfortunately, the man was not impressed. He explained that it was not the first time he had dealt with people making such claims. There were far too many fakes and scammers wandering around Belem. Yuri quickly realized that she had been too polite and thought she might need to be a little more forceful. The doorman sighed and explained that he saw countless children like her every day. He urged her to leave quickly because if she continued causing trouble, he would be the one blamed for it. Refusing to give up, Yuri grabbed onto him and desperately begged for a chance to see the Lord, insisting once again that she had brought an incredible item just for Ataraxia. The man tried to brush her off, saying that someone like her could not possibly understand such matters. At that moment, a voice suddenly interrupted them from behind. Yuri turned around and was immediately met with a very striking figure. To her, he looked like some sort of peacock. She could not understand why he was wearing such an extravagant overcoat when the weather was not even cold, and his hairstyle seemed equally unusual. The man calmly remarked that boundaries existed for a reason and that the two of them were being far too noisy. The doorman immediately apologized and addressed him as Lord. Yuri instantly realized that this was the very person she had been trying to meet. Without hesitation, she dropped to the ground and introduced herself as Yuri from the village of Ronda. She pleaded for a chance to speak with him and insisted that she truly possessed something valuable. The doorman apologized again and explained that the incident had happened while he was guarding the entrance alone. The Lord casually wondered whether he should increase the number of staff at the door before deciding to leave. Seeing her opportunity disappear, Yuri panicked. As the doorman restrained her and the Lord began walking away, he suddenly stopped and turned around. He calmly informed Yuri that anyone attempting to make a deal without first showing what they were offering would naturally be mistaken for a swindler. Before Yuri could properly respond, he continued on his way. She desperately called after him, but it was already too late. After he disappeared, Yuri finally learned that the man had indeed been the Lord of Ataraxia. She could not believe she had wasted such a perfect opportunity. Looking back, she realized she should have shown him her designs immediately instead of trying to explain everything first. The doorman soon asked her to move because he still had work to do. Yuri then asked when the Lord would come out again. The man admitted that he did not know. He explained that the Lord lived at the very top of the building and sometimes worked through the entire night. Yuri was shocked to learn that the Lord actually lived there. When she asked whether Ataraxia was not simply a boutique, the doorman explained that the building belonged to him and that he owned many properties. Hearing that, Yuri could not help but feel jealous. It must be nice to own so many buildings when some people had nowhere to sleep except beneath rooftops and eaves. She even wondered if the reason the Lord dressed so extravagantly was because he had already worn every outfit he owned. The doorman then asked whether she had a place to stay. Yuri immediately answered no and pointed out that if she did have somewhere to stay, she would not be standing there looking so miserable. Curious, she asked whether Ataraxia was ranked first among all boutiques in Belem. The man proudly confirmed it. Yuri then asked which boutique ranked second. To her surprise, he replied that there was no second place. When she questioned how that was possible, he explained that the Lord had hired almost every famous artisan in Belem. Years ago, boutiques had competed fiercely for second place, but now Ataraxia dominated everything. Yuri could only think that this was capitalism at its finest. She jokingly wished misfortune upon monopolies and begged someone to protect small business owners. Amused by her reaction, the doorman once again asked if she truly had nowhere to go. When Yuri repeated that she did not, the man admitted that he was simply trying to help her find somewhere to sleep. Touched by his kindness, Yuri immediately hugged him and apologized. That was how she ended up following him home. Along the way, she witnessed several children arguing over food. One accused another of stealing bread, while another argued that Plum had already eaten an apple the previous day. The children were clearly hungry and exhausted. Watching them bicker reminded Yuri of her younger sibling from her previous life. Eventually, they arrived at a small home. It was dirty, cramped, smelly, and messy, but Yuri was relieved nonetheless. At the very least, she had not ended up being accused of a crime or thrown onto the streets. The children curiously asked who she was and whether their brother had picked up another sibling. Hearing that made Yuri pause. Apparently, this was not the first time he had brought someone home. The man told the children to take care of the guests before introducing them. The twins were Plum and Apple. The boy was Rudy, and the baby was Mary. Although none of them were related by blood, they had somehow become a family. Yuri finally understood what the children had meant when they said he had picked up another sibling. Curious, she asked how old he was. When he replied that he was 23, Yuri was surprised. In her previous life, she had technically been older than him. Looking around the tiny room, she wondered where she was even supposed to sleep. The man immediately offered to hold Mary while sitting up and suggested that Yuri take his blanket instead. Yuri was genuinely touched by his generosity and thanked him sincerely. Rudy then pointed out that his older brother had brought her home because he was worried about her, so she should express her gratitude properly. Yuri insisted that she already had. However, she remained concerned about how he planned to sleep while holding a baby all night. Nobody seemed to have an answer. As Yuri looked around the room, her eyes landed on several large boxes. She asked whether she could use them. The man quickly explained that those boxes served as their dining table and insisted that she was not planning to sleep there. Yuri replied that she had no intention of using them as a bed. Instead, she seemed to have another idea in mind. She said to the man that he should know he had been very lucky today. Lesta was the head of Ataraxia, the #1 boutique in the artisan city of Bellum. He alone owned 30 ships, but even more famous than his wealth was his appearance. He dyed his hair using dyes developed by newly established workshops and constantly walked around wearing the most expensive clothes crafted by Ataraxia's seamstresses. In a way, he used his entire body as an advertisement for his business. Still, even he thought that saying he was willing to wear anything his artisans handed him sounded a little excessive. 1 week later, while reviewing reports, Lesta learned that apart from Bellum, prices everywhere else were rising rapidly. At the same time, Ataraxia's sales had also begun to decline recently. What he needed now was a good new product. Just then, someone greeted him. As Lesta turned around, his eyes immediately landed on a pair of pants. They were clearly not products from Ataraxia. The fabric looked shabby and the sewing appeared rough at first glance. He could not believe someone would walk around wearing clothes like that. For a moment, he even wondered if the salary he paid his employees was too low. However, the more he examined them, the more interested he became. Despite the cheap appearance, the finishing was neat and precise. Above all, the construction was unlike anything he had seen before. Curious, Lesta politely asked if he could take a closer look at the pants. The man agreed and even pulled back his jacket when requested. As Lesta inspected them, he noticed there was no belt hidden inside. Instead, the fabric had been folded and adjusted in an entirely different way. It was unlike the traditional finishing methods used throughout the kingdom. Immediately, he began wondering where such a design had come from. The man awkwardly apologized, saying he probably should not have worn something like that. Hearing those words only confirmed Lesta's suspicion. The person who made these clothes had to be that girl. Right on cue, Yuri appeared from behind and greeted him. When asked if she was the one who had made the pants, Yuri confidently admitted that she had. She also reminded him of the words he had told her before, that anyone trying to make a deal without showing what they had to offer would naturally be mistaken for a swindler. Taking his advice seriously, she had spent every day showing her work in front of the store. Lesta could only admit that she had successfully managed to get his attention. Meanwhile, Yuri could not help but think that he was incredibly handsome. Just as Allison had described, he truly looked like a walking advertisement model. In fact, she thought her pants would look even better if someone like him wore them. That kind of exposure would be the ultimate promotion. Lesta then asked Yuri to finally show him this amazing item she had been talking about. Excited, Yuri quickly presented a stack of papers. Lesta immediately recognized them as patterns used for cutting clothes and asked what exactly she intended to do with them. Yuri explained that with these patterns, clothes could be made much faster without needing every customer to be present for measurements. Not only that, but the clothes would remain comfortable to wear. She then encouraged him to take a look at the dress she was currently wearing. Lesta was surprised. That simple dress was her creation? There were no ribbons to tighten, no excessive buttons, and no unnecessary decoration. At first glance, it looked ordinary. The employees nearby could not understand what was supposed to be so impressive about it. Yuri proudly explained that she had made the dress in just a single day. By reducing unnecessary accessories and simplifying the design, production costs could be lowered significantly while making the clothes much easier to wear. Lesta understood her point. Instead of creating personalized outfits for every customer, she was proposing lightweight and comfortable ready-made clothing. However, he questioned who exactly such clothes would be for. Yuri simply answered that they were for people. Lesta pointed out that seamstresses would certainly appreciate needing less work, but he also knew the market well. Commoners rarely bought new clothes more than once or twice a year, and nobles would never be interested in something that appeared so simple. Once expensive accessories, decorations, and ironing were added, the advantage of quick production would disappear entirely. In his opinion, displaying a dress like that in a luxury boutique such as Ataraxia would only hurt the store's image. Yuri suddenly realized she had overlooked how expensive fabric actually was. Most commoners preferred making their own clothes and wore the same outfits for years. Lesta then suggested that she might have better luck running a small private boutique instead. However, Yuri refused to give up so easily. She immediately pointed toward the pants Allison was wearing and brought up another argument. Men's trousers often had oversized waistlines and were uncomfortable to wear. Even though aristocrats dressed elegantly, comfort was rarely considered. Lesta reminded her once again that Ataraxia did not sell clothes intended for commoners. Yuri then shifted her focus entirely. Instead of commoners, what about merchants? Bellum was a major trade city filled with wealthy merchants. Because they worked constantly, they could not dress in elaborate noble attire, yet they also did not want to look like ordinary commoners. Wouldn't people like that naturally come to Ataraxia looking for something in between? Clothes that were practical enough for work but elegant enough to display status. As Lesta listened, he found himself thinking more seriously about her proposal. Yuri then delivered her final question. Looking directly at him, she asked whether the clothes he wore every day were honestly comfortable. Welcome, it's Cultus and Bars Hire. As soon as the famous merchant arrived, he called for the shopkeeper. Yuri quickly greeted him, noting that it had been quite a while since his last visit. Bars Hire replied that it truly had been some time and asked how things had been. Yuri then asked about his wife, and Bars Hire laughed, saying she was doing so well that if he failed to buy her innerwear from Ataraxia, she would probably pluck out his beard. Yuri found the response amusing and asked whether he had come to place another bulk order. Bars Hire confirmed that he had. The underpants introduced by Ataraxia had become incredibly popular, and he wanted to order another 100 sets. Hearing that number surprised Yuri. She remarked that his wife and the other women around her must have really liked the products they had introduced before. However, Bars Hire explained that it was not just the women in his family. The entire city had fallen in love with the clothes produced by Ataraxia. Thanks to those products, he was making a great deal of money himself. Yuri was pleased to hear that. Although it was difficult traveling by boat to reach Bellum, everyone in the trade industry knew how famous Ataraxia had become. As Bars Hire looked around, he commented that no matter when he saw him, Lesta still looked like a fresh young man. He often wondered just how lucky Lesta was. 7 years ago, a mysterious child had suddenly appeared in front of Ataraxia, and not long after, the boutique had paid a tremendous amount of money to construct a new building. Even now, people still question where Lesta had found someone as talented as Yuri. His thoughts drifted back to their first meeting. At the time, Lesta had offered Yuri a position as the youngest designer at Ataraxia. He had even promised to pay 80% of a designer's salary from the start, with a full salary after a year. To everyone present, the offer sounded unbelievably generous. Ataraxia already employed experienced designers, so giving such a position to a child he barely knew seemed absurd. However, Yuri had immediately rejected the offer. Instead, she declared that she wanted to become Lesta's business partner. She boldly proposed a 6-to-4 profit split, with 6 shares for herself and 4 for Lesta. She even promised to handle the designs, patterns, and clothing production. To her, it sounded like a perfectly reasonable deal. Everyone was stunned. She was only 13 years old, yet she spoke with the confidence of a seasoned merchant. Lesta questioned whether she truly believed he could not simply use her ideas without officially hiring her. Yuri admitted that it was possible, but warned that he would eventually regret doing so. When Lesta asked why, Yuri pointed out that there was one thing he had never refuted. Deep down, he had already acknowledged the value of her ideas. Time passed. Yuri, the girl from Rhonda who had once arrived in Bellum with nothing, was now 20 years old. Officially, she worked as a shopkeeper at Ataraxia while continuing to design clothing unlike anything Bellum had ever seen before. Her creations completely changed the fashion industry. Lesta became the model for many of Yuri's designs, wearing outfits that looked simple compared to traditional noble clothing. At first, people mocked him. They called the clothes thin, plain, and lacking dignity. Many claimed they had never seen such strange garments before. Yet despite the criticism, people could not stop looking. The designs appeared neat, comfortable, and modern. Some argued that the clothes only looked good because Lesta was wearing them, but others admitted that they genuinely looked practical and stylish. Before long, more and more people began asking where they could buy clothes like his. They noticed that there were no tight stockings, no excessive layers, and none of the discomfort associated with noble fashion. Rumors spread about the mysterious designer responsible for these revolutionary outfits. People were amazed that the designer could create clothing quickly without requiring detailed measurements. Customers rushed to purchase the products, and demand exploded throughout the region. As Yuri's reputation continued to grow, stories about her success spread everywhere. One rumor claimed that a merchant from a neighboring country had offered her twice the amount Ataraxia paid, yet she had refused without hesitation. Another story involved Lady Melina from the pleasure city of Porto, who reportedly purchased 10 dresses at once. People constantly wondered where Lesta had managed to find such a talented young designer. Meanwhile, Yuri's influence extended beyond clothing. One day, a customer entered a shop searching for a new type of fruit jelly that Yuri had introduced. Excited customers began requesting grape jelly and every other flavor available. The shopkeeper quickly started wrapping up all the remaining stock. Unfortunately, the fruit jelly had almost completely sold out. When customers learned there was no more available, they were visibly disappointed. The person responsible for making the jelly had already left for the day, and the shopkeeper suggested returning tomorrow. However, many customers complained that they were too busy to wait. Some even suggested asking others to share. As the crowd continued discussing the products, one person suddenly became distracted by someone's appearance and could only think about how incredibly handsome he was. There was someone like him in Bellum? Yuri immediately noticed the sword at his side. Bellum did not permit people to carry swords, which meant he had to be a foreigner. More importantly, he was almost certainly either a soldier or a knight. Curious, she continued the conversation. The man brought up the fruit jelly and asked about it. Yuri was surprised when he bought all of it at once. Since she had been waiting a long time to get some herself, she nervously asked whether he planned to eat all of it. When he answered yes without hesitation, Yuri wondered if she could have at least a portion of it. However, after getting a better look at him, she became distracted. The man laughed, and Yuri could not help thinking that he was incredibly handsome when he smiled. Embarrassed, she apologized and admitted that she had only asked because she felt she should. She had simply been surprised that he wanted to buy all of it. The man jokingly suggested that perhaps she was surprised because he was too good-looking. Yuri awkwardly admitted that was partly true. He laughed again and explained that he was only joking. Yuri replied that when someone who was actually handsome said something like that, it somehow sounded acceptable. The man thanked her for the compliment. Wanting to be considerate, he then asked the shopkeeper to separate the grape jelly from the other flavors. Yuri told him that he really did not have to do that, but he simply explained that delicious food tasted better when shared with others. Yuri thanked him, pointing out that most people were not usually willing to share. The man reassured her that it was no problem. He mentioned that he used to eat these jellies often back home and had only wanted to try them again after not seeing them for a long time. Hearing that made Yuri curious about where he had come from. Since fruit jelly was considered a local cold dessert, she wondered how he knew about it. The man revealed that he was from Valencia. Yuri was immediately impressed. Valencia was far away, so she asked what had brought him all the way to Bellum. Secretly, she wondered if he might be there for something important. The man did not seem to mind the question and admitted that he had come to buy clothes. His name was Inan, and the person he served wanted more comfortable clothing. After searching in many places, he had finally come to Bellum after hearing about a boutique that produced remarkable clothes. Judging by what he had seen so far, he did not think the rumors were exaggerated at all. Yuri immediately realized that this was a perfect opportunity. Inan remarked that the clothes she was wearing looked far more comfortable than his own. Yuri happily agreed and asked if he would like a recommendation for a good clothing store. Before she could continue, the shopkeeper handed over the jelly order. Inan insisted on paying for Yuri's portion too. Yuri tried to refuse, but Inan insisted. In return, all he wanted was a recommendation for a good store. Just then, Lesta suddenly appeared. Spotting Yuri, he dramatically called her his angel. Yuri immediately looked disgusted and complained that whenever he called her that, people started thinking she was some kind of gigolo. Lesta jokingly declared that he would eliminate anyone who dared insult his wonderful angel. Yuri brushed off the ridiculous comment and handed him the jelly. She explained that it was fruit jelly and told him to share it after dinner. Lesta pointed out that he could have ordered some himself as she had told him earlier. Yuri reminded him that she had already ordered him to take a break within the next 30 minutes. Since he was always telling her to rest, she thought he should follow his own advice. Lesta admitted that thanks to Yuri, he had finally been able to breathe this week despite how busy the shop had been. Hearing that made Yuri relieved. Despite their success, Yuri often felt exhausted. Bellum was known as a city of artisans and merchants, but the business world was dominated entirely by men. Only men were allowed to exchange contracts, documents, and orders. Women were not even permitted to enter many artisan workshops. The idea of a female merchant was practically unheard of. That was why Yuri had spent the last 7 years pretending to be a man. Every single day she dressed like one, deepened her voice, cut her hair short, wore pants, and deliberately acted rough. Even after all those years, she still felt nervous about being discovered. Watching her, Lesta could not help but wonder. If he had accepted Yuri exactly as she was 7 years ago, would she have achieved the same level of success? Did she really have to become a man just to be acknowledged by society? Unfortunately, nobody knew the answer. While they were eating, Yuri suddenly brought up an interesting customer she had met earlier that day. According to her, a wealthy customer who looked like a nobleman had ordered several women's dresses. What made it strange was that he did not care about the price at all. His only requirements were that the dresses be comfortable, beautiful, and cool. Lesta found that unusual because customers of that status normally visited in person to be measured. Yuri guessed that they had probably heard about Ataraxia's new system. As long as customers provided their body measurements, the boutique could create properly fitted clothes without requiring them to visit. The customer had ordered 3 dresses in total. Since he had not specified any designs or occasions, Yuri decided to create 1 suitable for banquets and 2 intended for everyday wear. This reminded her of how the business had expanded. Most people assumed that merchants' wives had more free time than the merchants themselves, but Yuri knew that was far from the truth. Women were responsible for managing households, keeping records, and monitoring expenses every day. Many wanted new clothes but simply could not spend hours standing around in fitting rooms. Yuri's solution had been simple. She provided measuring tapes and allowed customers to take their own measurements and send them directly to Ataraxia. Before anyone realized it, the system became extremely popular among women and people living in distant cities. It completely changed the way they sold clothing. As Yuri reviewed the mysterious order one last time, she remembered that the customer had insisted the occasion did not matter. Still, she felt confident in her decision to prepare 1 formal dress and 2 casual ones. The total order value was an astonishing 10 million. Enin recalled the queen's words. Cixia had spent 10 years building her kingdom, and all she wanted now was to be satisfied with something as simple as her clothes. She had confidently declared that if she could build an entire kingdom, then surely she could change something as simple as fashion. No matter where Enin had to go, she ordered him to find the best clothing craftsman available. At first, Enin thought it would have been easier to simply ask the owner of the largest boutique in Valencia. After all, the royal seamstresses were considered the best in the kingdom. However, Cixia immediately dismissed that idea. She claimed they were too difficult to work with and ordered him to bring someone from somewhere else. To Enin, that was much easier said than done. Still, during the subjugation of the 99 kingdoms, he had learned one important lesson. Every nation possessed a unique culture, and fashion was no exception. Porto, the city of luxury and pleasure, was known as the center of women's fashion and the birthplace of countless trends. It took Enin 2 months to get there, only to discover something unexpected. The most fashionable women in Porto were no longer wearing clothes made locally. Instead, Porto's #1 beauty had reportedly purchased a dozen outfits from a single boutique. That boutique was none other than Ataraxia. Back in Belém, Yuri introduced herself properly as Ataraxia's manager and designer. Enin was visibly surprised. He had heard that Ataraxia's manager was over 30 years old. Yuri quickly explained that he was thinking of their lord, Lesta, and that she only managed part of the business. Enin then introduced himself as Renhelianart. Curious about Yuri's family background, he asked about her surname. Yuri casually replied that she did not have one and told him to simply call her Yuri. Enin immediately noticed how different she seemed compared to the nervous person he had met at the bakery. Here, she carried herself with confidence and authority. Even so, she did not appear particularly extraordinary at first glance. Yet somehow she was helping manage one of the largest boutiques in Belém. When she had asked for 10 million, Enin had honestly been shocked. It was an absurd amount of money. He questioned whether it was truly worth investing such a sum without even seeing the finished clothes. Still, if those clothes could make Queen Cixia comfortable, he would not hesitate to spend the money. The only way to know for certain was to investigate Ataraxia further. Later, one of Enin's men arrived with information. After looking into the matter, he confirmed that Ataraxia truly was the only boutique of its kind in the region. Enin jokingly remarked that if they had been in Valencia, such a slow report would have resulted in a pay cut. When asked whether they intended to proceed with the order, Enin revealed that they had already agreed to make a 5 million advance payment within a week. The customer had explained that he had not been in Belém for very long and wanted time to investigate Ataraxia's reputation before committing fully. Meanwhile, Yuri and Lesta discussed the situation. Lesta could barely believe the confidence Yuri possessed. Spending 10 million on just 3 dresses was extremely unusual. On top of that, the customer was from Valencia. Yuri immediately realized what that could mean. If she was lucky, this single order might solve several problems she had been struggling with for months. As Yuri reflected on her life, she admitted that things had not turned out the way she had imagined when she was 10 years old. Even so, she was making a tremendous amount of money. Every month she even sent money back home to Ronda. Yet strangely enough, earning money was more enjoyable to her than spending it. She wanted more. She wanted to keep making money until she had more than she could ever need. Men's clothing had already become a major success, but she knew the real opportunity lay elsewhere. The true source of profit was women's fashion. Unfortunately, convincing women to change their clothing was much harder. Whenever Yuri suggested more comfortable designs, most women immediately rejected the idea. They insisted they were perfectly fine. As a result, men's clothes and accessories sold extremely well, while women's fashion remained difficult to change. Even the hugely successful undergarments only sold because they were hidden beneath regular clothing. Women were afraid of criticism and reluctant to wear anything different from everyone else. Married women worried that unusual fashion choices would embarrass their husbands. Unmarried women feared becoming the target of rumors. Because of that, countless women continued wearing heavy and uncomfortable dresses despite hating them. That reality only strengthened Yuri's determination. She began imagining what would happen if a wealthy and influential woman started wearing one of her designs. If that woman happened to come from Valencia, the fashion capital of the continent, the impact would be even greater. Not long afterward, Annan officially discussed the payment. The advance alone was $5 million, half of the total price. Even successful merchants would struggle to gather that amount of money immediately. Most would need loans, collateral, and months of repayment. Annan explained that he would need a week before making the payment. Although ataraxia was clearly impressive, he could not simply hand over such a large sum without proper investigation. He planned to spend the week examining the boutique's reputation before making a final decision. Yuri completely understood. In fact, she found it exciting. Anyone willing to spend $10 million on 3 dresses had to be an important figure. That night, lying in bed, Yuri could barely contain her excitement. 5 million, 10 million. The numbers kept repeating in her head. It had also been a long time since she had met someone as handsome as Annan. He certainly did not seem like an ordinary person. He was wealthy, attractive, and carried himself with the confidence of someone important. For a brief moment, Yuri could not help thinking about how unfortunate it was that she was disguised as a man. What a waste. Then she quickly shook off the thought. None of that mattered. What mattered was money. She was going to keep making more and more of it. She would eat good food every day, sleep in comfortable beds, travel to the south, and enjoy a life of luxury. With those happy thoughts filling her mind, Yuri drifted off to sleep, convinced that she was going to have a wonderful dream that night. One dress would be designed for banquets and the other 2 for everyday wear. As Yuri thought about the order, she wondered what kind of design she should create and send to Valencia. Since Valencia was such a large and influential kingdom, its fashion was completely different from Bellem's. She also had to take the weather into consideration. Designing and producing the dresses would take time, and by the time they were completed and delivered, at least a month would probably have passed. If someone was willing to spend $10 million on just 3 dresses, they would naturally want to wear them as soon as possible. Fashion changed constantly, and the dresses would need to be comfortable, beautiful, and refined enough to satisfy Valencia's standards. Realizing she needed more information, Yuri decided to ask someone who knew Valencia well. Conveniently, Annan accepted her invitation to dinner. Serving meals to valuable clients was common practice, and Yuri hoped the relaxed atmosphere would help her gather information. While talking with him, she could not help noticing once again how handsome he was. Lesta was handsome too, but Yuri had spent so much time around him that she barely noticed anymore. Looking at Annan felt completely different. For a brief moment, she even felt a sense of healing, similar to the relief she had felt after taking a vacation following endless overtime work in her previous life. Still, work was work, and she quickly returned her focus to the dresses. Yuri began asking questions about Valencia. Since spring was approaching, she wanted to create dresses that matched the season. She asked what kind of banquets were usually held during spring in Valencia. Annan admitted that he was not entirely sure, but he expected there would be a particularly large banquet that year. The winter celebration at the palace had not gone very well because of the cold. The palace buildings were old, and many guests had suffered because of the freezing weather. As a result, public events in Valencia were often limited during winter. Yuri found that surprising considering the queen lived there. Annan explained that although the continent had been unified, it had only been a year since Queen Cixia returned to Valencia. She was so busy governing that she barely had time to hold banquets at all. Unlike rulers who enjoyed lavish gatherings regardless of their responsibilities, Cixia seemed far more focused on her duties. However, this upcoming spring marked the first anniversary of her return to Valencia, and her birthday also happened to fall during the same season. Because of that, a massive banquet was expected. Yuri remarked that Cixia sounded like a reasonable monarch. Since such an important event would attract people from many different backgrounds, she assumed nobles and influential guests from across the continent would attend. Annan confirmed that was likely the case. Curious about the mysterious customer, Yuri asked whether the woman Annan served would also attend such a banquet. Annan admitted that she probably would. However, he carefully avoided revealing her identity. That alone told Yuri that the woman held a very important position. After all, only someone with significant influence would receive an invitation to a gathering that even royal families struggled to attend. As the conversation continued, Annan mentioned that blonde hair had been fashionable in Valencia before he left. Yuri immediately wondered whether the woman he served happened to have blonde hair. Unfortunately, Annan politely refused to answer questions related to her identity. To Yuri, he felt like an impenetrable wall whenever the topic came up. Instead, Annan shifted the conversation toward fashion trends. He explained that wide open collars and exposed necklines had become popular, but because of the cold weather, large rounded collars around the neck were still common. He also mentioned that many women tightened their corsets so much that they became dizzy and occasionally collapsed. The woman he served often complained about how heavy and uncomfortable her clothing was. Even her daily outfits, which were considered relatively comfortable, wrapped around her body so tightly that she struggled every time she changed or tried to sleep. She also complained that her feet were constantly cold. Hearing all of this, Yuri realized that beauty standards in Valencia were not much different from those in Belém. Satisfied with the information she had gathered, Yuri asked whether there was anything else she should know. Annan pointed out that these were questions she ideally should have asked directly to the woman who would wear the dresses. Still, he understood that creating clothes for someone she had never met was extremely difficult. Although the request sounded unreasonable, he believed Ataraxia was capable of accomplishing it. He also reassured Yuri that the person he served was someone who always pursued what she wanted. She did not allow criticism, gossip, or disapproving looks from others to stop her. That subtle praise immediately caught Yuri's attention. Handsome men really did seem to have more than just attractive faces. Annan then casually mentioned that the woman had once expressed interest in a gown. Yuri was surprised and asked whether he had visited Ataraxia while she was away. Annan explained that someone had introduced him to the store and shown him around. He had originally come looking for clothes. Yuri found that suspicious. If he had traveled all the way to Belém to buy clothes for someone else, why was he looking at gowns and drawers, items normally associated with women? To her, he behaved exactly the way he looked. A little too charming. She quickly decided not to get involved personally with someone connected to such an important client. The more clues she gathered, the more she became convinced that the mysterious woman must hold a very high position. Someone wealthy enough to spend 10 million. Someone invited to royal banquets. Someone who did not care about public criticism. Perhaps she was Countess Electa, the queen's maid-in-law. When Yuri later asked Lesta about Countess Electa, he explained that she was one of the most famous noble women in Valencia. She managed everything from the queen's personal schedule to countless administrative duties. Electa was also known for rescuing Count Alexa when he had nearly been ruined by debt. Yuri was impressed. Lesta then pointed out that despite her influence, even Electa could not freely challenge the traditions of the palace. When Yuri asked why, Lesta gave a simple answer. It was the same reason Yuri had spent 7 years pretending to be a man. Hearing that made Yuri pause. It was remarkable that Queen Cixia had managed to rise to power in a society like that. Yuri admitted she knew a little about the political situation but wanted to understand more. Lesta explained that Queen Cixia had obtained the Cup of Rule from the tyrant Ubitha. The legendary artifact only responded to specific bloodlines. Ubitha had grown complacent and failed to use it properly. However, there was one person who changed everything. Annan Lionheart, the illegitimate child of Ubitha. Because the artifact only recognized blood relations, Annan's existence played a major role in Cixia's victory. Ubitha never imagined that his own illegitimate son would become so loyal to Cixia Valencia. Hearing all this, Yuri finally understood the scale of the people involved in her current order. If her client truly was connected to the queen's inner circle, then the dresses needed to be exceptional. At that point, Yuri finally reached a decision regarding the designs. She already knew what she wanted to create. The challenge would be the techniques required to make it work. Once completed, the dresses would not be simple one-time outfits. She wanted them to function as comfortable indoor wear while still maintaining elegance and beauty. Lesta immediately noticed the look in her eyes and commented that she had come up with something good again. Yuri accused him of smiling suspiciously, while Lesta defended himself by reminding her that she was the one who always insisted people should smile more to sell clothes. According to Yuri, handsome men looked good even when they frowned, but people still preferred handsome men who smiled. Lesta then teased her by asking if she liked handsome men. Yuri immediately questioned why he was asking. Lesta pointed out that Belém loved beautiful things, so it was a fair question. He even brought up Annan, mentioning that her important client's agent was quite handsome. Yuri dismissed the idea and claimed that while Annan was attractive, he seemed like a complete playboy. At first she had been impressed, but after learning that someone had shown him gowns and drawers shortly after arriving, she was no longer interested. Lesta laughed and suggested she might be misunderstanding the situation. Not long ago, a customer Yuri had met in Porto had been introduced to ataraxia. That same customer had traveled all the way from Valencia specifically to buy clothes. Realizing Lesta was talking about Inan, Yuri could only sigh. Why was it that handsome men always seemed to create complicated stories around themselves? Even so, one thing mattered more than anything else right now. She finally knew exactly what she was going to create this time. Cixia was sprawled across the floor, refusing to get up. When Inan told her to stand, she immediately complained that she did not want to. After all, she had spent months suffering because of a certain someone. Inan reminded her that he had been wandering around the continent for 6 months carrying out her orders. Cixia lazily argued back, asking who he thought was surviving on only 2 hours of sleep every day. She dramatically claimed that she was sacrificing herself for the people of the continent conquered by her wise cousin. Inan lightly nudged her with his foot and pointed out that nobody was blaming the people. In the end, she had brought most of these problems upon herself. Cixia rolled around on the floor before finally attempting to stand up, only to collapse again. She desperately wanted to sleep. She even suggested that Inan go outside and tell the mayor it would take another 3 hours before she was willing to meet anyone. Inan dryly remarked that for the first 2 hours, all he had done was watch her sleep. Was she really planning to spend the remaining hour explaining how she had used her money? Cixia immediately called it nonsense. Inan pointed out that after sleeping for 3 hours, she would probably need another 3 hours afterward. Eventually, he revealed that he had finally brought the item she had been searching for. That instantly caught her attention. When he mentioned that he had found something promising, Cixia demanded to see it immediately. Inan admitted that he had not personally tried it, which only made her more impatient. She ordered the guards to bring everything over. Despite her complaints, Cixia trusted Inan. No matter what, he always managed to bring back the very best. The order had finally arrived. 1 dress intended for a banquet and 2 designed for daily wear. There was even a note mentioning that the underclothes were included free of charge. As Cixia examined the garments, she noticed that the chest area was fully covered. Inan jokingly pointed out that since he had never revealed the buyer was the queen, the designers had probably assumed the customer was an elderly noblewoman. That explained why so much attention had been given to warmth, comfort, and practicality. Cixia laughed and admitted that the merchant had clearly put a great deal of thought into the design. Looking over the dress, she noticed the slender waistline and loose sleeves. At first glance, it did not seem very different from other dresses she had seen before. Then she realized something unusual. The entire outfit was made as a single piece. According to the merchant's explanation, there was no need for a farthingale, pannier, or corset. Instead of multiple separate pieces being layered together, this dress functioned as one complete garment. The goal was to dramatically reduce the time required to put it on. Even so, Cixia felt the design looked fairly ordinary from the outside. Inan then handed her a letter and suggested she read it first. The letter explained that the designer had struggled to understand how to wear the garments at first because they were unlike anything they had ever seen. The fabric itself was southern silk. Cixia immediately recognized its quality and wondered how it was meant to be worn. As attendants helped her change, she continued reading. The letter revealed that the designer believed customers should receive value for their money. Even if someone was willing to spend 10 million on 3 dresses, the designer did not want them to be criticized for wearing something too strange. New ideas always faced resistance. People naturally preferred familiar things and often dismissed anything unfamiliar as odd or ridiculous. Because of that, the designer had chosen to send a beautiful banquet dress that would still be socially acceptable. However, to prove that their promises were not empty words, they had also included a far more ambitious indoor dress. Reading those words left a strong impression on Cixia. She found herself admiring the designer's talent, confidence, and insight. Most people only focused on creating beautiful clothes, but this person had also thought about public perception and human nature. Finally, Cixia tried on the indoor dress. The moment she touched the fabric, her eyes widened. It was incredibly light. As she twirled around the room, she excitedly declared that it felt as if she were wearing nothing at all. Inan admitted that he had been surprised too. Considering it was made from silk, he had expected it to be much more difficult to handle. Cixia could barely contain her excitement. She immediately declared that she liked this merchant very much. Inan teased her by pointing out that there always seemed to be another man she liked. Perhaps she should just marry him. Cixia instantly shouted at him to stop joking. However, she remained completely serious about the dress. She ordered the remaining 5 million to be paid immediately. One of the older noblewomen present was even more impressed. Rather than paying the remaining balance, she suggested paying 10 million more. She wanted the designer brought directly to her as an exclusive personal designer. Sometime later, Lesta met with the elderly noblewoman to discuss the proposal. He immediately pointed out that the amount being offered was extraordinary. The woman calmly explained that it was not a one-time offer. She was proposing 10 million every 6 months. Given the current state of the kingdom's economy and currency integration, the value of such an offer was staggering. Even Lesta found himself tempted. However, he quickly explained that Yuri was not merely a designer. Yuri was a crucial part of Ataraxia. The woman responded by offering a fixed-term contract. During that period, Yuri would design clothes for her employer while still remaining connected to the store. She even offered favorable tax treatment and economic benefits that could potentially save Ataraxia enormous amounts of money every single day. The proposal was so generous that almost anyone would have accepted immediately. Yet Lesta refused. He explained that the clothing itself contained proprietary techniques and knowledge that only he and Yuri fully understood. One example involved special fabrics that reacted to heat and changed shape. Those techniques represented years of development and were among Ataraxia's greatest secrets. More importantly, Yuri was not simply an employee. Yuri constantly generated ideas while Lesta figured out how to turn those ideas into reality. Ataraxia's success depended on that partnership. Because of that, he could not confidently say he was willing to give Yuri up. The noblewoman quickly understood what he meant. This was not merely a designer being discussed. This was someone important enough to influence an entire industry. Lesta even pointed out that offering terms powerful enough to affect the kingdom's economy just to acquire a clothing designer was crossing a line. For a moment, he worried that he had offended her. Instead, the woman burst out laughing. She admitted that she had always assumed merchants would sell anything if the price was high enough, especially when such enormous profits were right in front of them. Seeing someone refuse despite the temptation was far more entertaining than she had expected. Queen Cixia casually remarked that she liked difficult men. Hearing those words, Countess Electa immediately addressed her as Your Highness. At that moment, Lesta realized there was only one person in the entire kingdom whom Countess Electa would address in such a manner. The woman standing before him was Queen Cixia herself. Shocked, Lesta instantly bowed and apologized, claiming he had committed a grave sin. Cixia simply laughed and pointed out that failing to recognize her was hardly a crime. After all, she rarely appeared in situations like this. She jokingly admitted that seeing a normal handsome man was refreshing after spending so much time surrounded by elderly officials who managed her meals and daily affairs. However, she quickly pushed those thoughts aside because she had more important matters to discuss. Returning to business, she once again brought up the tax benefits she was offering. This was Queen Cixia of Valencia, the ruler who had marched across the continent with the head of the tyrant Abitha tied to the end of her spear, eventually unifying the 99 kingdoms. Yet here she was personally negotiating tax benefits over clothing technology. Despite the overwhelming pressure of speaking to such a ruler, Lesta calmly replied that the decision ultimately depended on Yuri's intentions rather than his own. Cixia reminded him that she had heard he was the highest authority at Ataraxia. Lesta explained that while Yuri was technically his employee, treating him like an ordinary employee would never have allowed Ataraxia to grow into what it had become. Cixia found that answer interesting. In her eyes, he was rejecting substantial tax benefits for the sake of a simple designer. Even without the cup of governance, she possessed the natural aura of a ruler. Lesta immediately admitted that he had not realized who she was. Cixia commented that perhaps success had made him less sensible than before and instructed him to raise his head. She was tired of speaking to the tops of people's heads. Once he looked up, she casually remarked that he truly was handsome. The conversation soon shifted back to the clothing. Cixia explained that she had enjoyed the dressing gown immensely, but she had liked the indoor dress even more. Calling it knitted did not feel accurate because the craftsmanship was far too delicate for such a simple description. As Lesta listened, Cixia spoke about Valencia's harsh winters. Many neighboring cities practically died during the cold season. Businesses were forced to close, and people often struggled to survive until spring. That reality, according to Cixia, was one of the reasons she had built her kingdom in the first place. As a merchant himself, Lesta understood how expensive cotton was. Fur was even more costly. Cixia admitted that she personally could afford to stay warm until spring, but commoners did not have that luxury. If they could not work through the winter, they risked starving when spring finally arrived. Because of that, she planned to establish a cotton and textile industry as one of the kingdom's primary economic foundations. Giving Ataraxia tax benefits in exchange for its production technology was the least she felt she could do. These were not empty promises but the words of a monarch thinking about the future of her people. At that moment, Lesta almost felt grateful that she was discussing tax benefits rather than simply taking Yuri away by force. Still, another concern weighed heavily on his mind. What would happen if the entire world discovered that Yuri had been disguising herself as a man for years? Cixia dismissed the issue rather casually. In a kingdom ruled by a queen, being a woman was not inherently a problem. Of course, Ataraxia's reputation would suffer initially, and there would undoubtedly be scandals. However, with royal support and tax benefits, recovery would not be impossible. Then Cixia finally revealed her true goal. Put simply, she wanted to purchase Ataraxia's technology. She had already conducted extensive research and knew that while Lesta officially owned the boutique, much of its innovative technology belonged to Yuri. Naturally, the fact that she genuinely loved Yuri's clothing had also influenced her decision. Even so, Lesta could not ignore the consequences Yuri would face if her identity became public. Cixia informed him that Yuri would accompany her for at least 6 months and possibly as long as 3 years. In return, Ataraxia would receive tremendous exposure. The boutique would officially become a supplier to the queen herself. Just having Countess Electa wear Ataraxia's designs would make the store famous throughout the continent. Lesta could still remember Yuri's dream of becoming known everywhere. In many ways, this opportunity could make that dream come true. Eventually, Lesta agreed to receive the queen's command but requested some time. Yuri was currently in Valencia and would not return for another month. Before he could continue, Cixia reminded him that she had already investigated everything. She was fully aware of Yuri's location. When Lesta looked surprised, Cixia remarked that many people believed she had only united the kingdoms because of the cup of governance and good fortune. It was disappointing that someone as intelligent as him seemed to underestimate her in the same way. Meanwhile, Yuri was completely unaware of the queen's plans. While enjoying a stick of ice cream, she reflected on the latest dress she had designed. The Delphos gown would never have been possible without Lesta's assistance. Passing silk through heated ceramic rollers to permanently set the pleats had been a remarkable innovation. However, it was also expensive and difficult to reproduce consistently. Ataraxia's greatest strengths were speed, beauty, and comfort. Unlike Yuri's previous world, synthetic fibers did not exist here, meaning she could not rely solely on modern knowledge. Since Valencia now influenced fashion trends throughout the kingdom, she needed to understand exactly what was popular there. As she enjoyed her ice cream, she reminded herself that frozen treats were only available during winter. She had no idea when she would get another chance to eat them. Lesta would probably scold her for focusing on desserts instead of work, but Yuri could not help herself. While exploring Valencia, Yuri eventually stopped in front of a clothing store. The guard asked whether she intended to enter, and Yuri happily replied yes. Once inside, she noticed that Valencia's clothing stores were not dramatically different from Ataraxia. However, she was impressed by their leatherwork. The vibrant colors seemed almost impossible to achieve in such a cold region. Valencia's abundance of iron mines also helped support industries related to weapons, fur processing, and leather craftsmanship. As Yuri looked around, she overheard a conversation between several noble women. They were discussing Duke Lionheart. Apparently, countless people wanted him to marry, yet he remained unmarried despite being 26 years old. Some believed it was because of Queen Cixia. Others argued that he simply had no interest in pursuing power because he already owned the plains of Olympia and had spent the last 10 years helping conquer the continent. The conversation eventually turned toward marriage prospects. Several wealthy women openly discussed introducing their young daughters to the Duke. Hearing this shocked Yuri. The girls being discussed sounded only 13 or 14 years old. She could hardly believe people were seriously considering marriages between children and a man approaching 30. The age gap disturbed her greatly. It reminded her of her own arrival in Bellum when there had been a noticeable age difference between her and Lesta. However, because she retained memories from her previous life, her mental age was far older than her physical appearance suggested. She also remembered how wealthy merchants in Ronda would sometimes take young daughters from poor families and turn them into concubines. The more she listened, the more disgusted she became. These wealthy noblewomen were not acting out of poverty or desperation, yet they still discussed marrying off girls who were barely old enough to understand the world. Yuri finally decided she had heard enough. If she stayed any longer, she felt like she might be sick. Leaving the store, she muttered to herself that perhaps she was only getting upset because of her memories from her previous life. Or perhaps it was because she had run away from Rhonda. Or maybe it was simply because she had eaten churros for breakfast. Either way, Yuri knew her thoughts were becoming increasingly ridiculous. As Yuri was lost in thought, someone suddenly called out from behind her. She wondered who would call her like that and turned around, only to freeze in surprise. It was Enon. Enon greeted her warmly and remarked that he had not expected to see her again so soon after Bellum. What a coincidence it was. Yuri could not help thinking that handsome men somehow even sounded nicer when they spoke. She explained that she was currently in Valencia conducting market research and had not had a chance to inform him. Anna nodded but quickly noticed something else. Her voice sounded strange. It seemed like she had caught a cold. Yuri immediately agreed and explained that despite it being spring, Valencia was much colder than Belém. Ever since she arrived, the cold winds had been giving her trouble. After a small cough, Anna laughed and explained that first-time visitors rarely understood the wrath of Valencia's chilly winds. Fortunately, she seemed to be dressed warmly enough. Since they had unexpectedly met again, Anna suggested they sit down and have some tea together. He even recommended that she try Valencia's version of jelly while she was there. As they sat together enjoying tea and desserts, Yuri immediately brought up the topic she cared about most. She wanted to know whether the mysterious customer had liked the clothes she designed. Anna assured her that the customer was extremely pleased. Yuri excitedly asked what exactly the customer had liked. Although she had already received some information from Lesta, hearing compliments directly always made her happy. She admitted that no matter how many compliments she received, it never felt like enough. Anna found that amusing and asked whether she enjoyed praise that much. Yuri replied that everyone liked being appreciated. Curious, she asked whether he liked receiving compliments as well. When she mentioned family, Anna paused. The word family felt both distant and familiar to him. If family meant blood relatives, he had received very little affection in that regard. Still, he remembered one occasion when someone had told him that he had grown up magnificently. Thinking back on that memory, he admitted that he liked compliments very much. Yuri immediately agreed. Praise was wonderful no matter how many times someone heard it. As the conversation continued, Anna found himself observing Yuri more closely. On the surface, Yuri looked like an ordinary young man with nothing particularly remarkable about him. Yet Lesta had once said that anyone with talent would immediately recognize another talent shining brilliantly. Looking at Yuri now, Anna finally understood what he meant. He explained that the customer had especially loved the ambitious indoor gown and the extra dress Yuri had included as a gift. After trying it on, she had apparently twirled around the room several times and repeatedly praised how light it felt. The remaining payment would be transferred soon. Yuri barely cared about the payment. What truly excited her was whether the customer had tried on the banquet gown. With the spring banquet only a little over a month away, she desperately wanted feedback. Anna assured her that the gown had already been tested. Despite being made entirely from measurements and created remotely, the fit was nearly perfect. Yuri's eyes immediately lit up. Hearing such praise made her happier than any amount of money could. Watching her reaction, Anna could only think that she looked like a child receiving a reward. Yuri clearly loved being complimented. At the same time, Anna wondered how Yuri would react upon discovering the true identity of the person for whom those clothes had been designed. The customer had already expressed a desire to invite Yuri personally. Would Yuri freeze in shock upon meeting the queen? Or would she immediately drop to her knees in fear? Meanwhile, Yuri had already moved on to another concern. If she was going to be invited, she would need proper clothes. Anna looked surprised. From his perspective, the customer did not seem like someone who cared about elaborate appearances or empty vanity. Yuri agreed but pointed out that the customer seemed like the type of person who wore the same practical clothes for years. Even so, she had clearly spent a great deal of time thinking about them. Looking at Inan himself, she noticed his clothing and boots were barely different from those worn by commoners. Compared to Belém, he even looked slightly more worn out. For someone serving such an important lady, he seemed surprisingly unconcerned with his appearance. Inan admitted that the person he served did not care much about what he wore either. Yuri immediately declared that it was a waste. If she had a face like his, she would wear the most beautiful clothes in the entire world. Inan calmly replied that he had no interest in things like that. Yuri could not believe it and asked whether he truly had no desire to acquire such an interest. Inan explained that he simply did not have that much freedom. Hearing that made Yuri suspect that the queen probably treated her cousin like a servant who was available 24 hours a day. Yuri sighed dramatically and remarked that good clothes were expensive anyway. Then she began talking passionately about her dream. Her greatest wish was to create ready-made clothing that ordinary people could afford. The clothes sold at Ataraxia were sophisticated and beautiful, but they were also expensive. Commoners often had to think long and hard before buying even a single nice outfit. Yuri wanted to create beautiful clothes that everyone could wear at affordable prices. To accomplish that, she would need to make a lot more money. Inan remembered that Yuri's goal had always been to become rich, but now he realized there was more to it than simple greed. Yuri enthusiastically explained that after earning enough money, she wanted to hire countless workers, build factories, manufacture enormous amounts of fabric, and purchase huge amounts of land. Streamlining production would be possible, but distribution would be far more difficult. On top of that, she wanted to create jobs and guarantee employment for countless people. As Yuri continued talking, Enin could not help recalling Queen Sishia's own grand ambition. Sishia had once declared that she would conquer all 99 kingdoms, cast aside fools, gather capable people, and make them work together to build a better future. Listening to Yuri now produced a strangely similar feeling. Yuri eventually declared that her ultimate goal was to become the richest merchant on the continent. She wanted to buy the entire South, spend her old age in luxury, and live a life where everyone thanked and praised her. Hearing such ridiculous ambitions spoken with complete sincerity made Enin smile. Somehow, both Yuri and Sishia sounded equally absurd and equally convincing. He had a feeling this young merchant would one day become someone extraordinary. As evening arrived, Enin prepared to leave. He admitted that he had enjoyed spending time with Yuri that day. Yuri cheerfully replied that she had enjoyed it too. When she asked when they would meet again, Enin pointed out that future payments would likely be handled through the bank. Even so, he was certain they would cross paths again soon. As he left, his thoughts drifted toward the future. The kingdom still struggled with the gap between the wealthy north and the poorer south. Ever since the founding of the kingdom, balancing those differences had been one of the greatest challenges. Sishia constantly worked to secure food, jobs, and stable lives for her people. Many nobles had already lost their lands after attempting to avoid taxes or exploit their positions. Enin quietly wondered how someone like Yuri would fare in a world shaped by such a ruler. Before leaving completely, he told Yuri that he genuinely hoped to see her again. Meanwhile, Yuri returned home in an excellent mood. Today had been amazing. Enin had been handsome, polite, and surprisingly enjoyable to talk to. It felt like a complete cleanse. Looking around her surroundings, Yuri admired the insulation of the new building. Good insulation was essential in cold places like Valencia. She briefly wished she understood how systems like Ondal heating worked, but there was no point dwelling on it. Instead, she thought about Enin again. Despite claiming he had no freedom and rarely bought new clothes, he had still bought her jelly. Maybe she should send him a set of clothes later. Then a much better idea suddenly struck her. Why not commission a portrait painter instead? The thought immediately sparked another chain of ideas. Belém was small enough that simply having less to walk around was effective advertising. Valencia, however, was destined to become 10 times larger as the capital of the kingdom. Ataraxia needed a branch there. Not only that, they should hang giant portraits of handsome male models instead of ordinary signboards. They should attract elegant ladies and promote their women's fashion properly. For a moment, Yuri considered using Enin as a model before immediately rejecting the idea. Lesta would be a better choice. Enin was simply too perfect. A handsome man needed a certain sense of unattainability and pity to be truly memorable. As Yuri sighed, she realized there was still no one in either her current life or her previous one who truly matched what she was looking for. Before leaving, Yuri was asked whether she was sure she could travel alone. Plum even offered to come along with her. Yuri immediately pointed out that if Plum followed her everywhere like this, would she really be able to stand in front of the queen when the time came? Hearing that, Plum reluctantly backed down and simply told her to stay safe. Even then, Plum could not help worrying. No matter how much she thought about it, Yuri seemed like the kind of person who should not be left alone. Yuri reassured her that she would be fine and set off on her own. Meanwhile, the Valencia Palace stood as a symbol of the kingdom's growth. The kingdom of Valencia had not originally been this enormous. Aside from a few dozen iron mines, there had been nothing particularly remarkable about it. When Sishia Valencia first began her campaign, many people laughed at her ambitions. However, over the next 10 years, everything changed. After beheading the tyrant Abitha and uniting the 99 kingdoms, the once modest castle expanded alongside the growing territory. 2 steeples were added after several territories were conquered. New sections were built whenever kingdoms surrendered. Outer walls expanded repeatedly as the borders of the kingdom grew larger and larger. Eventually, Valencia became far greater than anyone could have imagined. In fact, when Sishia finally returned after years of conquest, even she was amazed by the size of her own castle. After getting lost for 2 hours while trying to find a bedroom, she reportedly ordered that large sections be demolished. When officials protested that such destruction would disrupt government affairs, Sishia simply ordered the eastern section rebuilt as a separate castle for her personal use. Thus, the magnificent Black Castle in the east was constructed. The remaining areas became known as the Western Palace. Visitors wishing to see the Queen had to stay in the Western Palace and pass through multiple walls before reaching her residence. Because Queen Sishia had declared that she would meet anyone with official business regardless of their status, Valencia Palace received hundreds of visitors every day. As a result, the civil servants managing the palace were constantly on the verge of exhaustion. One official silently complained that while the system was fair and reasonable, she had barely rested all week. She even wished visitors would keep their conversations shorter because every little discussion had to be recorded and documented. While processing guests, she noticed the next visitor on the list. The name was Yuri, with no surname attached. Assuming it was a commoner, she expected the meeting to be brief. Shortly afterward, Yuri arrived and explained that she had been told to meet someone named Prague. The official introduced herself as Prague and asked about Yuri's business. Yuri calmly replied that she had come to see the queen and then presented the royal letter bearing Sishia's seal. The moment Prague saw the seal, her entire attitude changed. She immediately realized that Yuri was carrying the queen's personal invitation. Guests with such invitations were supposed to receive priority treatment and be escorted directly to the queen. Yuri innocently explained that she had not known that and had simply joined the line after being told to do so by a doorkeeper. Realizing the mistake, Prague quickly apologized and ordered an attendant named Ivy to escort Yuri to the Eastern Palace immediately. Unfortunately, Ivy was already exhausted beyond belief. Still, she could not ignore an invitation bearing the queen's seal. Suppressing her fatigue, she asked Yuri to follow her. As they walked through the palace, Ivy silently suffered. She had not even had time to visit the restroom since morning. The old palace was enormous, the weather was cold, and she was already physically uncomfortable. Her clothes and undergarments were heavily stained with blood, but there simply had not been enough time to take care of herself. While walking, Yuri noticed that something seemed wrong and politely asked whether she was all right. Ivy brushed off the concern, but before she could say anything else, she suddenly collapsed. Yuri immediately panicked. She called out to her and looked around desperately for help. This was the royal palace in the capital of the kingdom. How could there be nobody nearby? As Yuri tried to support her, she realized how heavy Ivy's clothing was. Between the corset and the farthingale, even moving her was difficult. Thinking back, Yuri remembered how breathless Ivy had looked while climbing stairs earlier. Perhaps she should have refused the assignment altogether. Yuri quickly checked her condition. Ivy was still breathing, but her face had become frighteningly pale. Yuri knew what the problem was. The corset was making it difficult for Ivy to breathe. Personally, Yuri believed loosening the corset was the obvious solution. However, another problem immediately appeared. Yuri was publicly living as a man. If she touched a woman's clothing in the palace, what consequences would that bring for Ivy? For a brief moment, she hesitated. Then she decided that a person's life was more important than appearances. Repeatedly apologizing, Yuri loosened Ivy's corset. Almost immediately, Ivy's breathing became easier. Color slowly began returning to her face, and Yuri let out a sigh of relief. Looking at her, Yuri could not help thinking about corsets again. Since arriving in Valencia, she had created many dresses that did not require corsets at all. Yet women still insisted on wearing them underneath. No matter how much she emphasized comfort, people remained afraid of being different. Men who dressed simply were praised for being practical and trendsetters. Women who deviated from accepted standards were often criticized and judged harshly. Many were even asked whether they still wanted to marry if they abandoned their corsets. Watching Ivy suffer because of these expectations only strengthened Yuri's resolve. She remembered how Queen Sishia had genuinely liked her designs. At the very least, Yuri had succeeded in convincing the queen to remove her corset, even if only for a short time. Then another thought struck her. The queen's portrait would soon be distributed throughout the kingdom. Those official portraits were only produced once every 10 years. What would happen if the queen appeared in one without a corset? At the very least, perhaps women would stop fainting like this over the next decade. Perhaps making the queen a role model could slowly change things. Just as Yuri was lost in those thoughts, Ivy suddenly woke up. The moment she realized her clothing had been loosened, her eyes widened in horror. Yuri immediately tried to explain, but before she could finish, Ivy grabbed her and began shaking her in shock. Completely misunderstanding the situation, she slapped Yuri and demanded to know exactly what she thought she was doing. As Yuri was being captured by the guards, she could not help wondering how things had turned out like this. Lesta had specifically told her to go to the castle gates, explain that she was there to meet the queen, and show the letter bearing the royal seal. He had even offered to escort her personally if she felt nervous. Looking back on it now, Yuri regretted rejecting his offer. She desperately tried to explain herself, insisting that she had only loosened the woman's corset because she thought she could not breathe. The guard immediately dismissed her explanation and ordered her to stop making excuses. Yuri pleaded with them to believe her, but before she could continue, one of the guards struck her and repeated that he did not want to hear any excuses. Deep down, Yuri knew it was natural for them to misunderstand. As far as everyone knew, she was a man. She had become too complacent. For years she had lived comfortably in Bellum under the protection of her male identity and the influence of Lesta, one of the most powerful people in the city. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that her disguise could put her life at risk at any moment. Now she was facing the consequences. Part of her wanted to reveal the truth and admit that she was actually a woman. After all, if they knew that, perhaps the accusation of harassment would disappear. But another terrifying thought immediately followed. What if pretending to be a man was considered an even greater crime? The guards were already accusing her of molesting one of the queen's scribes and questioning whether the royal seal she carried was forged. Yuri repeatedly insisted that the seal was genuine and asked why she would ever forge something like that. The guards remained unconvinced. They argued that someone capable of disgracing one of the queen's attendants was perfectly capable of lying. One of them even reminded her that lying within the queen's castle was a felony serious enough to result in having one's tongue removed. Hearing those words sent a chill down Yuri's spine. If she revealed her secret now, would she lose her tongue for pretending to be a man all these years? Eventually, the guards informed her that Her Majesty had agreed to hear her full story personally. She was ordered to come and confess her sins directly before the queen. Yuri could not help noticing that the guards had suddenly become much more formal. As she was being escorted through the palace, panic continued to grow inside her. What exactly was she supposed to do now? Just then, she spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Enin. Yuri immediately called out to him. The moment Enin turned around and recognized her, surprise appeared on his face. He asked whether she had been well, though it was obvious she did not look well at all. Yuri had always seen him calm and composed, but this was the first time she had ever approached him looking so distressed. When Enin asked what had happened, the guards explained that Yuri had molested one of the queen's scribes. Enin looked directly at Yuri and asked whether that was true. Yuri immediately denied it. She explained that the woman had collapsed while escorting her. Thinking that the corset was restricting her breathing, Yuri had loosened it to help her. Unfortunately, it had all been misunderstood. Enin listened carefully before asking why she had not simply called for help. Yuri replied that there had been no one around. If the woman truly had been suffocating, she had needed help immediately. Enin sighed and asked whether Yuri had considered the lady's honor before acting. Yuri looked confused. Enin repeated the question, asking whether she had thought about the lady's honor or even Her Majesty's honor. In this world, he explained, honor was often considered more important than death itself. They were standing inside the royal palace, surrounded by countless eyes. A scandal could emerge from even the smallest misunderstanding. The story of a guest invited by the queen molesting one of her scribes could spread through the kingdom in an instant. Although Enin admitted he believed Yuri had acted with good intentions, he also admitted that he found it difficult to help her. He hoped that if her actions had truly been motivated by kindness, things would somehow turn out well. The coldness in his gaze stung Yuri more than she expected. Before leaving, Enin quietly instructed a servant not to reveal his title. When an attendant asked where he was going, he simply replied that he was going to see his sister. Even his assistant seemed surprised, reminding him that he had claimed he would not enter the palace again that day. Enin only replied that something important had come up. Meanwhile, Ivy was struggling to process everything that had happened. She could not believe she would end up meeting such important people under these circumstances. Countess Electa personally came to check on her condition and gently asked how she was feeling. Ivy immediately insisted that she was fine and explained that Yuri had not actually harmed her. The truth was that she had fainted because of menstrual pain. However, when she woke up and discovered her dress had been loosened, she had panicked and felt as though she had experienced a nightmare. Countess Electa carefully asked whether she would be emotionally prepared to speak about the incident later. She stressed that Ivy should not pretend to be fine simply because she was speaking to her superior. The most important thing was Ivy's physical and mental condition. Hearing such sincere concern from someone of Countess Electa's status almost brought tears to Ivy's eyes. She admitted that she truly was all right. If all she needed to do was tell her story, she could do so all day long. Satisfied with her answer, Countess Electa escorted her toward the queen. Soon, Ivy found herself standing before the ruler of the entire continent. Queen Cicia of Valencia sat before her in all her glory. Ivy could hardly believe what she was seeing. Even the queen's dress seemed almost mystical. Overwhelmed, Ivy immediately bowed and delivered the formal greeting she had memorized countless times since becoming a scribe. She introduced herself as Ivy of Alcon and offered her respects to the supreme ruler. To her amazement, Queen Cicia responded personally and even addressed her by both her first name and surname. Ivy nearly burst into tears. She had practiced those greetings hundreds of times, but never once imagined she would stand before the queen herself. Cicia explained that she had already heard about the assault and apologized for summoning Ivy so quickly after the incident. Looking at her carefully, the queen remarked that Ivy still did not appear completely fine. Ivy quickly insisted that she truly was all right and admitted that she was simply overwhelmed by the opportunity to stand before Her Majesty. Cicia smiled slightly before deciding to begin from the start. She calmly asked Ivy to tell her everything that had happened. Then, with a much more serious expression, the queen asked the most important question of all. Had that man caused her any physical or emotional harm that could threaten her safety in any way? Queen Cixia listened carefully as Ivy gave her testimony. She began by asking the most important question. Had that man caused her any physical or mental harm that could pose a serious threat to her safety? Normally, matters like this would be handled entirely by Countess Electa, but this case involved a guest who had been personally invited by the queen. Ivy could not help wondering just how important Yuri was to Her Majesty. Although incidents involving harassment of female officials usually called for severe punishment, Ivy honestly replied that no real harm had been done. Cixia immediately asked whether Ivy was minimizing the damage because she felt intimidated by the fact that Yuri was her guest. The queen firmly explained that while Yuri might be important to her, Ivy was far more important at that moment. Hearing those words left Ivy completely speechless. The queen's concern was so genuine that for a brief moment she forgot how to respond. Embarrassed, she quickly apologized and admitted that she had been overwhelmed by Her Majesty's kindness. Cixia gently reminded her to stay composed. Ivy then explained that the incident had ultimately begun because of her own physical condition. Cixia immediately corrected her. It was not entirely her fault. The queen had already reviewed the situation repeatedly. She recalled Yuri's desperate explanations about believing that Ivy could not breathe because of her corset. He had insisted over and over that he had only been trying to help. After gathering her thoughts, Ivy finally admitted the truth. To be completely precise, she had collapsed because of menstrual pain. When she fell, Yuri had genuinely tried to save her. Although she hesitated while speaking, she ultimately swore that her testimony was not influenced by Yuri's status as the queen's guest. Hearing that, Cixia nodded. If the victim herself believed the act had been done in good faith, then Yuri should not be punished. Since her scribe had spoken, there was no need for further testimony regarding the incident. The accusation would be resolved. However, Cixia pointed out that even if the perpetrator's guilt was removed, Ivy's embarrassment and distress still remained. Countess Electa agreed. As an unmarried woman living in Valencia, Ivy still had to face the social consequences of the incident. Since there was no longer a criminal to punish, the focus now shifted toward compensating the victim for any damages. Before discussing compensation, Cixia asked another question. She wanted to know more about Ivy's physical condition. If she was ill, the queen would grant her time to recover. If her condition had been caused by overwork, she would receive both leave and compensation. Cixia made it clear that Ivy was not required to answer if she felt uncomfortable discussing it publicly. The question itself left Ivy stunned. Discussing something like that directly before the queen felt impossible. Sensing her discomfort, Cixia immediately dropped the subject. Since the incident had occurred during working hours, compensation would be provided from the royal treasury regardless. Still, Cixia asked whether there were other problems she wished to report. Ivy hesitated before deciding to start with the easiest issue. There simply were not enough officials assigned to the West Wing. According to palace regulations, officials handling royal audiences were supposed to receive a full day off after every 10 days of work. However, those rules were rarely followed because there were too few staff members available. Cixia quickly summarized the problem. The staff were overworked. When she asked why, Ivy explained that too many people wished to meet the queen while too few officials were available to process their requests. Without hesitation, Cixia ordered the number of staff to be tripled by the end of the month. The officials around her were stunned. Tripling the staff seemed excessive. Cixia immediately dismissed their concerns. There was no shortage of budget, and the current system clearly was not working. Ivy respectfully pointed out that the biggest bottleneck was not the staff but the queen herself. There was only one Cixia, and the pace of royal audiences could not keep up with demand. Cixia simply replied that she would handle her own workload and ordered the chancellor to recruit more people. The chancellor accepted the command immediately. When Cixia asked whether there were any additional concerns, Ivy requested permission to submit the remaining issues in a written report later. The queen agreed at once. After all, Ivy had already fainted once that day, and there was no reason to exhaust her further. As a result, Ivy was granted an additional month of paid leave along with compensation. The doorkeepers responsible for failing to properly verify Yuri's invitation also received disciplinary action and had a month's salary deducted. With Ivy's matter resolved, only one person remained, Yuri of Bellum. Cixia turned her attention toward him. Although the accusation had been cleared, that did not erase his recklessness and poor judgment. The queen explained that she had originally intended to grant him a great honor. However, because of his actions, that honor had become much more difficult to justify. Even so, she was willing to offer him another chance. Cixia revealed that Lesta had originally made two requests. First, Ataraxia would receive tax benefits while retaining control over its manufacturing techniques and cotton silk production. Second, Yuri would serve as her exclusive costume designer for 6 months. Normally, becoming the queen's exclusive supplier was the greatest honor a merchant could receive. More valuable than tax benefits, more valuable than wealth, and more valuable than influence. Cixia admitted that she genuinely loved Yuri's clothing and had been looking forward to wearing his designs personally. However, after the incident, she found herself questioning whether she could trust someone so impulsive with such responsibility. Yuri immediately apologized and lowered his head. Cixia quickly stopped him. She hated speaking to people who refused to look her in the eye. She ordered him to raise his head. If Yuri truly believed he had risked scandal and dishonor to save another person, then perhaps he possessed a compassionate heart and a genuine desire to help others. Confused, Yuri could only stare at her. Cixia then turned to the chancellor and asked how many ladies in waiting, servant girls, attendants, and stable workers lived within the castle. The answer was roughly 500 people. Cixia seemed disappointed. Considering the size of the castle, she had expected even more. Since only one person truly lived there, however, the number made sense. Then the queen presented her challenge. Yuri's clothes were comfortable, but they were also expensive. Only people of wealth and status could realistically afford garments made from silk. The fabric itself was costly, and even without knowing the exact techniques involved, Cixia could tell that a tremendous amount of labor went into creating them. Therefore, Yuri's task was simple. He would design clothing that 500 ordinary palace workers would genuinely enjoy wearing. The total cost of each outfit could not exceed 1,500. Hearing the number shocked Yuri. 1,500 was roughly equivalent to 12 days' worth of meals for a family of 4. Nevertheless, Cixia continued. He would have 1 month to complete the challenge. During that time, he could bring his seamstresses into the palace and use its facilities freely. Any development expenses would be covered by the royal treasury as long as all spending was properly reported. If the ladies in waiting, servants, attendants, and even the stable workers genuinely liked his clothing, then he would receive the tax benefits and retain ownership of his cotton silk technology. However, if he failed, Cixia warned him that she would make sure not even his shadow entered the palace again. At that moment, Enon arrived. Cixia immediately noticed him and reminded him that he had claimed he would not return to the palace that day. She already knew why he had come. It was because of the tailor. Looking directly at him, she asked a simple question. Did he think Yuri was a bastard or not? Enon answered honestly. Both the owner and the tailor possessed good reputation. He did not believe either of them were bad people. However, given the circumstances, Yuri had undeniably behaved like an idiot. Cixia laughed and remarked that Enon had always been a good judge of character. Internally, Enon struggled with the situation. Yuri was passionate, hardworking, and genuinely proud of the clothes he created. It felt like a waste to see him stumble because of a misunderstanding. Perhaps he was simply drawn to people like that. Cixia then reminded him that rumors rarely told the full story. After all, many people believed Duke Lionheart was a womanizing drunk obsessed with alcohol and beautiful women. Enon immediately asked whether the rumors had really become that bad. Cixia replied that some even claimed he preferred young girls. Horrified, Enon protested immediately. Cixia laughed and told him that if he married and had a child, she would make him king. Enon begged her not to say such terrifying things. Ultimately, he admitted that he could not condemn Yuri based solely on appearances and circumstances. He trusted his own judgment more than rumors. Cixia accepted that answer but reminded him that even trustworthy people could be deceived. As the conversation came to an end, Cixia wondered aloud what the merchant would do next. Meanwhile, Enon suddenly remembered something strange. Thinking back to their meeting, he realized that Yuri had casually drunk from his glass without hesitation. For some reason, that memory lingered in his mind.